Brides, Chapter 4, Part 1, Trouble on Peckerwood. If Hub Trevitt hadn't peeked into Granny's window while the quilters were working on their second coverlet, nobody might have ever gleaned the story of that night on Peckerwood Mountain, or suspected for an instant that one of the girls presently engaged in making a quilt was about to walk off with Hub, one of the hardest bachelors to trap in the whole high-walled hollow. Or, if they'd have guessed that Hub was tired of his own cooking, they never would in their wildest flights have thought of Kedron Hardy as the wife-to-be. Nor would Kedron have whispered it. Hardys aren't given to gabbing. But Hub did peek into the cabin with its gaggle of Bisley girls and was seen. "It's Hub!" someone shrieked. And a quick hand, Travis Swishers, sped over the sill and grabbed his hat. There's no way like it for keeping a man from bolting. "Who's he looking for?" cried all the girls but one. They stared about. Kedron Hardy alone was keeping Cottontail still. "Ho, ho, ho, tell us about this, Kedron." Kedron wouldn't. There's just about no way to make a Hardy budge if a Hardy doesn't want to. So knowing Hardy's stock, they gave up on Kedron, but they still had Hub's hat, and therefore Hub. "Come in, Hub Trevitt. March right in here and out with it." Hub was of silent stock, too. Besides, he could pretty well be terrorized by one woman, let alone 20. He was brought to the door and stood there, his eyes dumbly on Kedron's. She wasn't helping Hub out. She sat still and smug. "Tell what this business is all about, Hub Trevitt, and we'll finish this quilt for you. Basket of flowers pattern. Mighty pretty. A quilt like this'll be a cozy thing to have up there on your trap line." Hub blinked at the quilt. He could use it. "Mighty cozy for you and Kedron." Hub went brick-colored, knew it, felt the 20 pairs of laughing eyes, and flared crimson. "Well, girls, since he won't loosen his tongue, let's burn his hat. Into the fire with it." With a cry of pain, Hub surrendered and told all. Trudging through last December's dusk, Hub said he should have been more noticing. But he was tuckered and hungry, and a measure of time had gone by since a Hardy and a Trevitt had chucked lead at each other. He pulled a mink trap, found it sprung and robbed by its sly quarry, reset it, scattered fresh grouse feathers and fish oil about the stump, and moved on. He looked to a muskrat barrel artfully planted in an ice hole. The slit paper head was still strewn with leaves and snow. Mr. Muskrat, though a clumsy brain in his pants, hadn't yet nosed the carrot bait. Hub pushed along, craving to get his supper fire started. He stopped short. Wild honeysuckle vines had been dragged down out of some oaks. The long strands, winter tough and leafless, lay in a tangled ball. What in Tunket would do that? Behind the trees, the hard snow and frozen mud were churned, and a square hole yawned. Hub recalled with a start. That was the hidden site of an old pit trap, log-walled and deep enough to hold an elk or a bear. Game pretty well cleared from this region. The trapper was a big, deliberate young man. He unslung the load of pelts from his back. His grandfather, Bashan Trevitt, or maybe Bashan's father, had built that deadfall. Its top could be rotten. A man could take a spill and land in pesky company. Peering in, he couldn't make out much. He took hold of an overhanging bough and lowered his head and shoulders. He drew back with a hunter's quickness. What was down there wore pants and a shirt. Then it could be a Hardy. The Hardy trap line ran on the other side of Peckerwood Mountain. The summit ridge was the dividing line, and a solemn one it was, after decades of shot swapping. It made Hub hair roots prickle, the thought of that strife starting up again. Senseless warfare it had been, filled with sudden seat grabbing and high stepping, and sometimes with lasting sprawl into the reddening dirt. In recent years there had been an uneasy truce, but if a Hardy, now, had rashly crossed the summit, fooling with Trevitt traps, "Come out," ordered Hub. The shape didn't stir and didn't speak. Well, then he'd pull it out. He tested the opening and swung in, landing cat-like. He warned in language a Hardy would understand. "No tricks or I'll stick a knife in your belly and walk around you." He made out in the murk that the figure was seated on the ground against the cold wall. Why, it wasn't more than a boy, a puny Peasley boy. He grasped the shirt. There was a gasp. He tried to pull the form to its feet, but it didn't come. A stone-weighted timber had fallen, pinning it. He dragged the moldy beam away, caught the figure under the arms, and started to heist it. His hands dropped as if they'd grabbed knives. Oh! It took him an instant to recover. Why didn't you tell me? Still no word, no whimper. He raised his voice. Are you hurt? He'd have to get her up into the waning daylight to find out. He grasped again, firmly this time, and tossed her up through the opening. He pulled himself up after. He toted her to the heaped honeysuckle, felt for broken bones. A knee was swollen and hot beneath its outside pants leg. He called loudly, for she remained stubbornly mute. It's only a bad bang and a wrench. Can you hear me? Whatever tied her tongue, fright or socks, cussedness or shame, a dummy she remained. But he couldn't leave her here. He swung her to shoulder like a dressed deer, caught up his pack with his free hand, and plunged onward. It was a mile to his cabin, the third year he'd wintered there alone. He pushed in and dumped her to the edge of his rude bed. He lit the lantern and held it to her face. She was young, pale, scrawny, but angry and defiant. She was at bay and knew it. He'd seen that look in the eyes of hundreds of trapped forest creatures. Her features were a Hardy's, he was sure of it. Her clothing was a jumble of men's stuff, all too big for her. Jim, Ob, and Hake Hardy could have worn it, and probably had, long and hard before passing it on to their kid sister. Her hair was gobbed with mud. Frightened or no, she sat waiting, her eyes wary, hands tensed on the edge of the bed. She must have been raised on tales of the devil-horned Trevets. So she knew that in brushes between Hardys and Trevets, the Trevets always came out best. The more fool she, gritted Hub, for prodding and prying unbidden on this side of the mountain. The more blockhead for not watching where she stepped. It wouldn't be so bad if he hadn't found her in the hole and had been forced to lug her here. Temper gripped him. You crossed the ridge. You messed among my traps. You knew that sneaking and prying on this side of Peckerwood would start a heap of trouble. If her kinfolk got the wrong idea, it could start all over again. The generations-old warfare that had filled 4 graves and set several Hardys and 2 Trevets limping for life. I ought to give you every inch of a thumping. Sweat broke out on her clay streaked forehead, in a cold cabin, too. He remembered that she was hurt. All right, he said less roughly. He began to feel sorry for this ragtag bundle with the taut muscles and the smeared face. Get it in your head I'm not gonna whop ya. Or do like Grandpa Trevet did with Aurelia Hubbard. No Trevet and no Hardy ever forgot what started the families to warring. Bash and Trevet, riding lickety-clatter, had scooped the bridle-wreathed Aurelia up and slang her across his saddle just as the preacher was about to tie her for life to Claghorn Hardy. Aurelia had been so hard slammed that the horse made 20 bounds before she could reach Bash with a good telling punch, and all he had done for the blow was kiss her ringless fingers and laugh. By the time the Hardys had untracked themselves, Bash had gained Big Piney Ferry and pulled himself and Aurelia across and cut the rope. Aurelia had mothered and grandmothered 46 Trevets after that, each new Trevet thinking up taunts that kept the Hardys grabbing rifles, until the uneasy peace of the present now risked all over again by this silly poacher. He shook the grate down and quickly got a fire roaring. Now we'll see to that knee. She tried to draw back. Her fists knotted. He covered them with a big paw. Let's be friends until I begin pouring down the medicine. He tucked her sinewy fists under her, knelt and pushed the thick pant leg up. We'll have to skin these breeches off, poke your shirt tail around you and get most of you under the kivers. She tussled some, but he whipped a blanket around her and briskly gained victory. He pitched the dragged-off garment to the foot of the bed. He worked the bared knee gently. She sat there leaning back on her hands, her face white with rage and torment. Nope, nothing's broke. I'll wrop it with snow. Here, wash your face, it'll pert you up. He handed her a damp rag. She flung it at him. He put his powerful hand behind her head, wiped her face off, half expecting her to bite. Aurelia Hubbard had probably fought like this when she was stolen, but she had been about a year older, pretty as a rainbow, according to Tell, and doubly pretty because of all rigged out for her wedding day. The girl's muddy nose came out of the ruckus, no fine feature like Granny Aurelia's, but a dished-up snub. Her eyes burned hotly. He couldn't make out whether she was deaf and dumb or only mulish, but a woman who could hold her tongue like that deserved respect. He fetched a pan of snow, packed her knee with it, and then said, for she'd been spunky, "Time for you and me to eat." He tended the stove, and the air grew pungent. Deer liver and onions. Other odors took hold, some pleasant, some hateful. Elm bark tea with yellow root, pepper, gizzard linen, 9 drops of kerosene, and 3 of asafoetida. We call it Granny Aurelia's body and spirit mender. It was her standby for chills, rheumy, fever, tired bones, and peevishness. If Clag Hardy had hung on to Aurelia as a good man should, stead of trading her for hoof gravel in the face, you Hardys would have been raised on Aurelia's mender, and you'd have amounted to some shucks. Open your mouth, even if you never use it to say anything. She shrank back, her teeth clenched. Open! When she wouldn't, he pried her jaws apart with fingers that had trained on steel traps and poured. She got away from the cup finally, knocking it flying. He grinned. You'll pull through. You can scrap like a badger tailed to a spring pole. Now we'll have supper. He kicked a stool to the bedside and placed a plate filled on it. He stood away, eating from the pan. For a time she stayed sullen and ignored the dish, but the whiffs from it were too much. She looked at him with eyes that could kill, but she nibbled. He paid no attention to this sign of one more Trevitt victory. She yielded then. She gobbled. She stowed with relish. Color came into her cheeks. He put his emptied pan aside and tossed her a comb. You still look like something that's been up a tree all night. You better curry that hank. He turned his back and washed the utensils. When he glanced her way, she'd clawed the clay clumps from the tousle. Her hair was long and bright. Now listen to me. He'd grown used to the one-way conversation. He expected no answer. This is going to be a cold night outside, and the footing will be slicker than goose grease. If you try to go home, you'll probably fall and really wreck that knee, or stick a leg into a fox trap. Getting you home calls for a sled and daylight for me to make one. So you're here to stay overnight. The girl viewed him levelly, not moving, though maybe she couldn't hear him, couldn't understand. He continued, There's only one bed to this place. You're in it. Her eyes didn't shift. So, he finished, you get the cabin. I'm sleeping out. He stoked the stove. He spread her breeches to dry. He flipped the top blanket out from under her arms. You can make do without this one. He caught up the lantern and went forth. The cold slugged him like an iron bar, but he was used to winter weather on this high slope. His 20 years of life had known hardy schooling. If the night had been blowy, he'd have built a brush shelter. In that still air, he needed only a fire a few feet from a tall rock. He lay down between the rock and the fire in the single blanket and watched the dance of the sparks. Twice he woke and built up his blaze and stole in and kept up the fire in the cabin's rock stove. By its red flicker, her hair was shiny on the balsam needle pillow. She looked more child than woman, sleeping calm like that, her face no longer frightened, angry, or pain-twisted. Given a soaping up and a ribbon to her hair, she could be quite pretty, he decided. Pretty as a brass-jacketed bullet. He put the thought away, not liking it. In the morning he stomped to the cabin, whistling and thumping his boot toes to the doorstep. He called out to the closed door, not wanting to take her by surprise. He bunted it open with an armful of firewood. Save for the rumpled bed and warm hearth, the hut might have been empty for weeks. "Hey!" shouted Hub Trevitt. She was gone.